So our next lecture is going to be focusing to some extent on ideological developments, the kind of beginnings of the formulation of Arab national identity. And before we actually speak specifically about that development, I do want to provide a little background on nationalism in general, because nationalism, very often people think of that term as meaning like kind of patriotism, love of one's country, and that's part of it. But I'm talking about nationalism more as a way of thinking about one's identity as part of a larger community. Right? So, I mean, in this sense, one might identify as, say, Polish or Russian, but maybe even have a negative view of their country, right? So it doesn't have to be patriotic. They would nonetheless feel that somehow, even if with great regret, that there is somehow Russian and Polish, or Polish respectively, right? Or American, or whatever identity you want to choose, right? And, for a lot of people, this is such a natural way of thinking about who we are, right? Like if we're traveling and someone asks you what you are, like almost immediately our response is a nationalistic one. Granted, in New York, and this would require kind of discussing nationalism in a kind of at a much deeper level, right? But in some places like New York, people might not necessarily identify as American. They might identify based on where their family came from, or if they're a first-generation immigrant, where they themselves came from. There's a certain fluidity to it. It doesn't depend just on how you identify yourself, but also how others see you. So I've had a lot of students who tell me, if I say, what is your national identity? They say Dominican. But then they might point out that, well, when they go back to Dominican Republic, they tend to be perceived as American, like somehow they're not recognized as Dominican. And I've heard similar kinds of stories, people coming from Pakistan or India, and so forth. And even an individual might choose to identify themselves differently depending on where they are, the context, who they're talking to, and so forth. The main point I want to make is most historians feel that national identity is a fairly modern phenomena, starting roughly with the French Revolution, right? It's this kind of new way of identifying who one is as part of a larger group. There's some debate about maybe there were the kind of antecedents for this kind of conception of identity even before that. But definitely from that point forward, it really becomes quite pervasive, right? You start to see the development of nationalist movements around the world, beginning perhaps in Western Europe, but then spreading to other parts of Europe, other parts, for instance, the Middle East, Asia, certainly in the Americas, and so forth. So, this it's not like what we're talking about is like something that existed everywhere and just kind of always eternally existed and just only began to find its way to the Middle East in the 19th century. And most important too is most historians see it as a kind of constructed identity. It's not a case of like a people discovering who they were, but more that they're kind of inventing or constructing an identity. Granted, very often using the raw material of past historical events and so forth, shared language and culture, as a way of kind of shaping and defining that identity. Very often there is disagreement about the boundaries on those identities, who should be included, whether someone is a subset of an identity or they actually constitute something completely distinct and so forth. So these kinds of developments are happening across the globe during the 19th century and eventually in the Middle East as well. And we're primarily concerned in this case with the formulation of Arab identity, right? So very often if we think about which people occupy the Middle East or who are the dominant people, we think of, in a nationalistic sense, that they are the Arab people. What's interesting, though, is if you were to call someone an Arab at the beginning of the 19th century, you almost certainly meant a Bedouin. This is not how people would have identified themselves, right? So if by the way, if you're reading like even a Western source, like a missionary writing in, say, 1820, and they refer to different people as being Arab, they're talking about Bedouin. The people in the towns and cities would have been referred to as very often Muslim, religion being a very important identity marker, but also not just signifying that you have a set of beliefs and practices, but that you're part of kind of the political mainstream or social mainstream in the Ottoman Empire, or maybe Turk, which didn't always mean the idea of kind of people who are ethnically Turkish. would have, in a sense, just meant an urbanite of the Ottoman Empire, shall we say. But you wouldn't have called someone living in a city or town an Arab, right? And that's eventually going to change. So, again, like most people at the beginning of the 19th century, and this is not just in the Ottoman Empire, but, many parts of the world, would have identified themselves communally in a way other than nationalistically. Again, in the Ottoman Empire, as Muslim, perhaps based on the city you came from, as Damascene. It might be a regional identity as Nablusi, coming from the area of Nablus in Palestine. Uh, Clan and tribe would continue to matter for much of the 19th century. So, particularly if you were of the Hashemite clan, which is the same clan that Muhammad came from, you would probably be very proud of that. But you wouldn't have called yourself an Arab. Now, as far as the people that, us as historians looking at the history of that region, who we would define as Arabs, they had not, in fact, ruled themselves politically since the time of the Crusades. For the most part, political elites for quite a number of centuries at this point were either of Turkic background. Obviously this is, pertains to the Ottoman Empire in particular. In some case, but it also would have, in a sense, constituted the Mamluks. A Persian identity also sometimes part of that equation, but not Arabs. And this didn't really matter, right? There was never a feeling of, oh, we're being ruled by foreigners, right? That these are, like somehow these people have no right to have political authority over us. As long as the political authorities were Muslim and they upheld Sharia in some fashion, at least in principle, and remembering that Sharia very often was applied in a very flexible way, that was perfectly acceptable. Now, as of the beginning of the 19th century, as far as who the Arabs were, the vast majority of them resided in the Ottoman Empire. So, I mean, the one exception, if we in terms of qualifying a bit, is we could say that we already saw how Egypt had become independent under Muhammad Ali, after the French had been forced out. But this is a bit complicated because depending on what point in history you're talking about, Egyptians might, on the one hand, claim to be Arabs. They speak Arabic. Historically and culturally, as I hope we've seen in this course, they're kind of part of the Arab world, part of the Middle East. But on the other hand, very often promoting the idea that they are, somehow as Egyptians, a distinct people. And in some ways, under Muhammad Ali and his successors, more often than not, there would be this kind of promotion of Egypt as something distinct from the rest of the Arab world. But on the other hand, remember that Egypt is still nominally, in theory, under Ottoman rule, even if in actual practice pretty much independent, right? So Arabs under Ottoman rule, and this is a period when the Ottoman Empire is going into a state of decline. They're losing territory, and so there's kind of a general concern about how to address that problem. Now, again, as I mentioned, Egypt is something of an exception. Again, in theory, under Ottoman authority, but you might remember that at some point Muhammad Ali had even attacked the Ottoman Empire to the point of threatening its existence. So the title of the ruler there is Khedive, or viceroy, kind of governor, right? Kind of signifying that, in theory, they recognize the Ottoman Sultan as having greater authority. And you might remember that by the time we get to Ismail, right, there had been this kind of great modernization program underway, particularly under him. And it is interesting to consider, right? I mean, he very famously himself said, my country is no longer in Africa. Or we might say he really meant by this, not part of the Middle East. We are now part of Europe, right? So he is someone who really did kind of emphasize the idea that Egypt was somehow distinct from the Arab countries. Now, nationalism in Egypt only beginning to get underway, only beginning to kind of gain a foothold in the 1870s, 1880s, around the time that he was governing. And even there was, among kind of intellectuals, and very often nationalism kind of begins with more educated people, intellectuals who, are kind of learning about nationalism as an ideology. And so they're kind of part of the process of creating identity. And even they were tending to emphasize the idea that Egypt is somehow something distinct from the neighboring Arab countries. Now, you might remember the big problem with Ismail is that he had put Egypt heavily in debt to the point that they were threatening to default, right? Not being able to go bankrupt, not being able to pay the money they owed. And this money was owed primarily to Europe, more specifically, primarily to the British and the French. And that included both the British and French governments, but that also included banks and other kinds of institutions and individuals who were putting pressure on their governments like, we want our money back. And at some point, the British and French decided they needed to take control of Egypt's finances, right? So by 1878, Egypt's indebtedness, particularly to the British and French, had become so immense that the British and French imposed what's known as the dual financial control, which is kind of where we left off, right? What that meant is that you had a British official as Minister of Finance, right? So controlling the revenue coming in, and a French minister as Minister of Public Works. So between the two of them, controlling the money coming in and controlling how it was spent. And it's kind of hard to really talk about a country being independent if it doesn't control its own finances. Ismail was forced to accept this, and he did push back a bit. Eventually, the British actually forced him to step down in favor of his son Tawfiq, who became Khedive in 1879. So he actually would prove to be much better at the role of puppet. Though for now, in theory, Egypt's still independent. He would actually govern until 1892. When he died, at which point his son Abbas II would take over. During his reign, we're going to really start to see the beginnings of Egyptian nationalism in the form of the Urabi movement, right? And this is going to be headed up by army officers, one in particular, someone who, and this was something kind of new, up until this point, generally speaking, officers had been of Turkic backgrounds. So Urabi is one of the first actual native-born Egyptians to achieve officer class. And he's going to become the spokesperson for this kind of Egyptian nationalist movement, which is really going to take hold of the imagination of many Egyptians. And there's kind of two things they're pushing back against. On the one hand, this kind of growing resentment of Egypt's domination by foreign powers, right? And there's nothing, in a way, nothing serves as a better catalyst for generating a sense of us than a well-defined them, right? Like kind of an enemy that we can all kind of rally against. So that becomes kind of an important factor. But the other thing is they also want more representative government, right? So a lot of Egyptians, particularly intellectuals and students, have been learning new ideas about political representation and so forth, and really want to see that applied there. So they're also pushing back against the idea of an autocratic ruler like Tawfiq. And what we see here in this image is kind of an early confrontation between Urabi on the one side and Tawfiq on the other, the one on horseback. And it's kind of worth looking at this exchange a little bit more closely. Right, so again, Urabi, the full name, Ahmed Urabi, an Egyptian army officer who's become kind of the spokesperson, right, the voice of Egyptian nationalism. And so when he confronts the Khedive, Tawfiq says to him, "You have no right to ask for all these demands. For I, the Khalifa, have inherited this land, Egypt." It's almost like a form of, rule by divine right. To which Urabi replies, "God has created us free. God did not create us to be, excuse the typo, inherited like property. I swear by Allah, who there is no God except him, from now on we Egyptians will never be inherited or treated as slaves again." And I'd like us to think about the language there, which superficially, we see references to Islam, references to Allah, and kind of praise to God. But in many regards, that is the language of the Enlightenment, very similar to the kind of language that will inform, for instance, the Declaration of Independence, right? The idea that God has given us inalienable rights, that he's created all men equal and free. So you can really see kind of, that kind of language being incorporated into the political discourse in Egypt. Now, what's really interesting here from a perspective of the history of colonialism, right? One of the justifications the British always use for creating a colonial empire is that they were, in this way promoting new values, like political values, like, representative government and so forth. So on that basis, you might think that the British would be supportive of Urabi. But at the end of the day, their primary concern was with getting back their investments, right? So, and some of this reflects pressures being put on their government by banking institutions and so forth. But ultimately, they really don't want democracy in Egypt. They'd rather be dealing with one individual who has all the power than some kind of parliamentary government that's in constant flux. And beginning in May 1882, the British and French stationed their fleets off the coast of Egypt near Alexandria. This is actually going to provoke demonstrations and even riots on the part of Egyptian nationalists who feel very much threatened by this. At some point, it really becomes more a British operation than a French one. They're especially concerned about the Suez Canal, which has become a very, very important location with respect to the British Empire. The most important colony of the British Empire is India, so the Suez Canal is seen as kind of imperative to linking Britain with India. They often refer to India as the crown jewel and the Suez Canal as the lifeline of the British Empire. Eventually, as revolts start to get further and further out of hand, the British fleet begins to bombard the city. This is in July. And then finally, the British decide on a full-scale military invasion, at which point the French drop out completely. They're disinclined to take military action. And the decisive battle ends up being the Battle of Tel-al-Kebir in September of 1882. And it's militarily pretty decisive. From that point on, the British will be in complete control of Egypt. They swear by God that they're only going to stay there until Egypt gets its financial house in order. As soon as that's done, we're in the wind. And in fairness to the British, they probably did imagine they would only stay on for a few years. In actual fact, the British will not fully evacuate Egypt until 1954. So what was meant to be a temporary occupation ends up being one of much longer duration. And by the way, when the United States invaded and occupied Iraq, very similar in Afghanistan, there was always the idea that we're only here temporarily. And one might understand why the people of Iraq and people in the Middle East in general were a bit skeptical. It was really a case of, deja vu. We've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. We now turn to the Ottoman Empire, which, where we left off, we discussed how there was this feeling of a need for reform, that the empire should modernize to some degree along European lines. Mostly a reflection of the fact, kind of growing perception that the empire is in a state of decline. In fact, the nickname during the 19th century for the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe, a phrase coined by a Russian czar, but definitely reflected a sentiment that many felt was accurate, that many felt in the Ottoman Empire. And, a lot of this reflected just simply the fact of military losses, loss of territory, that this map illustrates quite well. It's kind of color-coded, but you can see at some point rapidly losing territory in Southeast Europe, what you see there in the orange and dark brown. We've already discussed how at some point Egypt is only nominally a part of the Ottoman Empire. After 1882, effectively a European colony. So by the time we get to the First World War, pretty much all that's left is roughly what corresponds to modern-day Turkey, and then the Arab territories in the Middle East. Now, to be sure, even those who felt reform was necessary, there really wasn't much talk about, for instance, breaking away from the Ottoman Empire, certainly not on the basis of nationalism. If we're talking about the Asian parts of the empire, European parts are very different, right? And that's a major factor, kind of the growing prevalence of nationalism leading to these nationalist movements among peoples like the Bulgarians, Serbs, Greeks, and so forth, who at some point desire to break away from the Ottoman Empire. But among the Arab population, and certainly the Turkish one, right up until the First World War, pretty much loyal Ottoman subjects. And there will be a growing dissatisfaction among some Arabs with Turkish rule, and some of that will reflect kind of the growing influence of Arab nationalism. But there's really no one calling for the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, during this period of increasing European colonial and imperial influence, there are many, the basic frame of mind is united we stand, divided we fall. It's kind of the feeling the Ottoman Empire The maintenance of its integrity is the best hope for the Islamic world to resist Western domination, right? So, anything that you might do to undermine the Ottoman Empire ultimately would be very harmful to Islam and the Islamic world. Now, having said that, we should, again, we've talked about this before, but a large number of Ottoman subjects, even in the Arab territories, are in fact Christian. Particularly if we're talking, and they tend to be concentrated in certain regions, so particularly if we're talking about kind of along the coastline of what today is Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon. And this is a modern map here just to kind of show you the region we're talking about. At this time, all part of the Ottoman Empire. And I should also emphasize that nobody refers to this area as Israel at this point. It is considered to be Palestine. But in any event, right, there are large numbers of Christians there. If we count Egypt, which has a sizable Christian population, you could say about a quarter of the Arabic-speaking population is in fact Christian. Let's say roughly around the middle towards the end of the 19th century. So in Egypt, you have a large Christian population. They belong to their own Egyptian church known as the Coptic Church. We unfortunately don't have a lot of time to explore that. They have a very interesting history. You also have large numbers of Christians in what today is Lebanon and Israel, Palestine. The vast majority are Greek Orthodox, though with the growing influence of Arab nationalism, many Greek Orthodox Christians who speak Arabic are going to kind of assert their identity as being Arab Orthodox against this idea of Greek Orthodox. One Christian population we should make special note of is the Maronite Christian population, mostly concentrated in the area around Mount Lebanon, which would be in the kind of the northern part of this map. So the Maronite Christian population, right, they're a very distinct sect. Many of their practices very much resembling Greek Orthodoxy, but technically they're Catholic because at an early point in their history, they made a decision to recognize the authority of the Pope. But there was kind of an agreement that the Pope would not try to impose Latin Catholic practices, what pretty much makes up the majority of Catholics in the world, on the Maronites. They would be allowed to maintain their own specific rites, traditions, and even liturgical language, the language they used in the church. What this does mean, though, that from an early point they had pretty strong ties with the Vatican and also with Europe, particularly France, who by the 19th century has come to see itself as kind of the protector of the Maronite Christian population. And this kind of sense of having a unique identity is going to be a very important factor in the creation of a Lebanese state in the future. Now, we talked about this kind of need for reform. We discussed in a previous lecture the Tanzimat reforms, right? This kind of series of reforms, kind of a larger program to basically rapidly modernize the Ottoman Empire. And among other things, it promoted the principle of religious equality, right? So the idea that, and you might remember that most people in the Ottoman Empire defined their kind of social and political position on the basis of their faith. If you were Muslim, you were part of the mainstream. Most Christians belonged to a millet, which was semi-autonomous, where they could manage their own affairs. The Jews as well, right? So that had kind of defined your position in the empire. So now they're not going to exactly abolish the millet system, but the idea is to really kind of diminish its importance, where everyone, instead of being an Ottoman subject whose position is defined by their faith, will now be an Ottoman citizen with equal rights and equal obligations, right? So it's kind of the principle of religious equality. And as it turns out, I mean, some Muslims weren't happy with it initially, and there's kind of a feeling of, that we had enjoyed kind of a preeminent position socially and politically, and this is being eroded. But many Christians were not happy with it either. On the one hand, they certainly liked the idea of having more rights, but they weren't too keen, for instance, on fulfilling obligations such as military service, which, by the way, is for 20 years, right? Something that Christians and Jews had been able to avoid until now. And in fact, they will continue to avoid it by paying a special tax, but in principle, they are now supposed to do military service. And as I mentioned, some Muslims are a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that Christians are now political equals. So we should note that by the end of the century, for the most part, this had become much more accepted. But again, many Christians also not happy, preferring millet status. And the military thing was a major factor in that. But it also reflected the fact that many Christians in the empire had strong ties with Europe. So this reflected a number of factors. First of all, you had the capitulations, these kind of special trade arrangements with European powers that allowed European merchants operating in the Ottoman Empire almost a kind of diplomatic immunity where they were not subject to Ottoman law, and they also were not subject to certain Ottoman taxes, which obviously gave them a major advantage with respect to their Ottoman competitors. But very often they would start extending these rights to to Ottoman Christians who they would take on as clients, maybe operating as kind of a middleman, or maybe in some kind of diplomatic fashion as a translator for a consul. Consul would have been a European representative in a particular city, like kind of a minor ambassador. And so many Christians are, like developing strong relations, very often in connection with trade, but also politically, with one or another of the European powers, on the basis of which they gain certain advantages. And they seem more keen on kind of cultivating that connection rather than their status as an Ottoman citizen. And we should note that the European powers often present themselves, in fact, as protectors of different Christian groups in the empire, right? So this becomes kind of a pretext for basically interfering in domestic affairs whenever they see fit, which they often do through the councils. Again, these kind of more kind of minor ambassadorships to different cities in the Ottoman Empire. So the French, they present themselves as protectors of Latin Catholics, but also Maronites, right? And sometimes this role is actually stipulated in legal documents, in treaties, and so forth, right? So it's not just some kind of, kind of vague idea that they might somehow be looking out for them. Very often they have specific rights in terms of their actions within the Ottoman Empire. Russians, in some ways more intrusive, they claim to represent Greek Orthodox, later on also including Arab Orthodox when they start kind of asserting that identity. And given that the vast majority of Christians in the Ottoman Empire are Orthodox, this is no small thing. And as you might imagine, this kind of relationship is going to raise uncomfortable questions about where Christian loyalties lie. So for instance, if the Ottoman Empire is at war with Russia, many Muslims are going to be wondering whether their Orthodox compatriots are supporting the Ottoman Empire or hoping for a Russian victory. And it's a fair question. You actually have evidence that very often Orthodox Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire were rooting for the enemy. So it's against this background that we're going to see the growing pervasiveness of nationalism, right? Again, this kind of way of defining who you are as part as a larger communal identity. And so, nationalist ideology, kind of an awareness of this, right, in terms of being educated in it. A lot of this is going to happen via Western missionary schools. Western missionaries becoming very active in the Ottoman Empire, in large measure because they enjoy European protection. But one way that they try to spread the good word is through the founding of schools, especially in Syria. So probably most active in this regard are going to be the French missionaries. So they're going to establish French missionary schools. And, initially, primarily these are serving Catholic students. Maronite and Catholic parents would send their children here. But eventually, other religious groups are going to start entering the schools. For instance, certainly Orthodox, but even Muslims in some cases would send their children here thinking they're going to get a very European-style secular kind of education that will serve them well after they graduate. Right? So these schools become very popular, not because of the religion, but because of the kind of education they provide. But nonetheless, right? I mean, students who attend these schools are being exposed to European influence. They're using French as their language of instruction. Many of them will go on to study in France. And so many of them are kind of identifying with France on this basis. Russian missionary schools aren't going to be quite as pervasive, even though the great majority of Christians in the Arab countries are Orthodox. And part of the problem is they just don't prove to be very popular, right? So there's not going to be that many, but there's not like a high demand for them. Some of this reflects that a lot of parents, even if they're Orthodox, they'd rather send their kids to learn in a French missionary school. French is considered to be a much more valuable language. Russian is extremely hard. And heck, I mean, if you're going to continue your education, after you finish in the school and maybe you go to university, you'd rather go to Paris, generally speaking, than Moscow. Now, with respect to nationalism, however, probably most important are the Protestant missionaries, missionary schools, I should say. So many Christian Arabs are going to be attracted to these schools. And even though there is no like great power that claims to protect Protestants, and even as of the latter part of the 19th century, there is not a huge number of Protestants in the Ottoman Empire. So, this is kind of mostly by the efforts of American, British, and German Protestant missionaries who mostly target other Christians for conversion. But the real appeal of these schools is going to be that they use Arabic as the language of instruction, even while not overly emphasizing Protestantism, right? There's this kind of idea like, really promote the fact of this really wonderful secular education, and then hope that when the students come, that by being indirectly exposed to Protestantism they might convert. But nonetheless, right, one of the main appeals is the fact that they use Arabic as the language of instruction. So there's going to be a lot of translating going on of European texts into Arabic. And this is also going to be part of an Arabic literary revival as the language is being developed now to discuss different kinds of topics, right? Like many of them related to science, related to the social sciences, philosophy, learning about the history and political developments in Europe and so forth. But in connection with this, right, those who are kind of part of this project, so they're learning in Arabic, they're helping to translate works into Arabic and so forth, but they're also developing a great love of their language and a kind of nationalist consciousness in connection with that. And in fact, many nationalist movements that are taking place in Europe at this time very much centered on this kind of love of language. Especially important is going to be the Syrian Protestant College, today known as the American University of Beirut, right? So this is like one of the, probably the most important institution of higher learning in the Middle East during this period, and remains so even until now. And so, the Protestants, Protestant Arabs who are studying there, this is a higher level of learning, and some of them will go on to found what many consider to be the first known Arab nationalist party, founded in 1875 by 5 graduates of the Syrian Protestant College. Um, Now, there's been a lot of debate about, was this really Arab nationalism, or were they promoting more kind of Syrian nationalism based on the Arabic language? So it's not clear if they sought an independent Arab state. Maybe some even were promoting more an independent Lebanese Christian state. But it really doesn't matter in a way because whatever they're promoting it on the basis of a shared language. And in this respect, kind of reaching out to their fellow Muslims, the idea that we all speak Arabic, we all share the same culture, the same historical legacy. So kind of developing a conception of Arab nationalism ultimately that is primarily rooted in the Arabic language and doesn't really emphasize Islam as an aspect of that identity. Even if, there's kind of a sense that even as a Christian Arab, you might take pride in the fact that your people established one of the great world religions and so forth, right? But it doesn't become somehow necessary to be a Muslim to be properly Arabic, right? And they also promote kind of ideas about, what kind of government the Arab people might one day seek, right? That they, kind of a lot of ideas about representative government, liberal democracy, and so forth. The idea that the government should represent the people, as we often think of it in our own country. Now, having said that, right, it's really, these are very important first steps in the development of Arab nationalism, but pretty much up until the end of the 19th century, the vast majority of Arabs, and the vast majority of those were in fact Muslims, still identified primarily on the basis of their faith. And this kind of secular model of Arab nationalism had very limited appeal. And what we're going to, when we pick up this lecture, in the second part, we're going to learn that alongside this kind of development of a secular model of Arab nationalism based on language, we're going to see the development of a different strain of Arab nationalism, one wherein Islam is much more emphasized as a very important aspect of that identity, and in some ways is a reaction against what are perceived to be Ottoman centralizing tendencies, that the Ottoman government is trying to impose itself too much from the center, and that would have included also promoting the Turkish language. And I should say Ottoman Turkish, which is very different from what they speak in Turkey today, but kind of promoting that at the expense of Arabic, right? Both as a language of administration and a language of instruction. So we'll stop here, and I would ask you now to turn to the second half of this lecture.